So in the last lecture module, we tried to sort out what we might mean when we talk about the difference between functionalism with a capital F and psychofunctionalism. In this module, we want to pivot our attention over to Bloch's anchor or central thought experiment, this homunculi head thought experiment. These sorts of experiments, they try to cultivate or generate a vignette, a scenario in which we've got what seems like someone, something acting in exactly the ways that the functionalist theory would predict. All of the inputs and outputs, the stimulus and responses, the overt behaviors, all of those are exactly the same. However, what's maintaining that input and output, stimulus response, overt behavior connection, what's inside, as it were, between that, it isn't a candidate for mentality, even though it still satisfies all the internal relationships that it needs to in order to be an instance of the theory. And Bloch does this in a clever way. He says, look, let's get the inputs and outputs. We'll get those right because we'll just specify that it's a body minus a central nervous system. And so all of the inputs and outputs are still going to be the same descriptions of bodily movements and so on. Now we'll connect these disembodied creatures to an army of homunculi. And that mapping will be from every individual neuron that that person had. The headless horseman's had all the neurons in it. The brainwashing guys had all his neurons. There'll be a person for every single neuron. And they'll be connected to each other and to the body in all the same ways that those neurons were with the brain there. And we'll connect them all up, say, through Wi-Fi. Now, Bloch says, what we've got all the overt behaviors, the inputs and outputs, the stimulus and responses, they're exactly the same because it's the same body. If we want to talk about whether or not the internal states are the same, well, we've got a one-to-one mapping between homunculi and neurons. Surely that's going to be enough to make the internal states map on to the theory in a way that satisfies the theory. But now we look at this and we go, okay, well, our headless horseman, our brainwashing dude, they are input-output, functionally equivalent to us, but they don't look like candidates for mentality. There's all these homunculi over here. They're doing all the job of maintaining everything, but they don't seem to be experiencing pain. They don't seem to be making decisions. They don't seem to be doing any of those things. They're just talking to each other and to the body through their Wi-Fi connected headphones so as to connect inputs and outputs in exactly the same manner as the individual neurons would were they present. So the homunculi don't seem like a good candidate for mentality, and yet they seem to satisfy the functional definition, that Ramsey correlate specification. So how does Bloch proceed from that initial characterization of the absent qualia or homunculi head argument? I actually think he proceeds along three different tracks, pursues three different lines of argument. And so I'll try and sketch out each of them because he seems to hop back and forth between them in a way that I think undermines the overall cohesiveness of the paper. So I think the three tracks all are keyed on to different notions of what the explananda is, what is being explained at any given moment in time. I think the first track just focuses on mentality generically. It just says, let's just explain mentality generally. Now in this line, I think Bloch first considers functionalism with a capital F. And he says, when I see this homunculi-headed example, functionalism with a capital F just looks too liberal. It can't say anything but the homunculi head has mentality. And that doesn't seem right. He then considers psychofunctionalism. And when we're talking about mentality generally, he seems to suggest that psychofunctionalism doesn't fall victim to that, or it's a cure for liberalism. And he seems to pursue this line of thought that when we switch to psychofunctionalism, we're able to specify inputs in a much more anthropocentric fashion, pushing them farther and farther inward until we get to the point, until we get to the antenna, so that we can rule out the homunculi case. However, he thinks by making things more and more anthropocentric in terms of our input and output characterizations, we then make the theory more and more chauvinistic. Now, I think this actually kind of comes to a head or is emphasized not in terms of inputs and outputs, but in terms of the theoretic terms and laws when he talks about the humans versus the Martian case. In that case, it doesn't seem like it's the inputs and outputs. They seem relatively similar to each other. Instead, he thinks the difference here, the difference that he characterizes here, is one of the theoretic terms and the interrelationships within the theory in that narrow sense that he talks about. So that he seems to be giving a version of the holism argument there, but he also seems to have the chauvinistic argument running in terms of inputs and outputs too. So he seems to recognize that psychofunctionalism may well result in something that is chauvinistic and anthropocentric, both in terms of its characterizations of inputs and outputs, and in terms of the way that it characterizes mental terms theoretically and the relationships through its various laws. He considers the potential cure for this as introducing a sort of universal psychofunctionalism, but he thinks that this notion is dubious. The idea of characterizing all of the different potential functional relationships between all the different potential theoretical terms and characterizations of inputs and outputs in a generic way that captures all and only the mental things and excludes all others, he thinks there's no reason to suppose that's a project that we can actually complete. In the last lecture module, we'll go ahead and look at the two other lines of thought that I think Bloch pursues, characterizing them in terms of the explananda that seems to be the most salient on those lines of thought.